Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Racial Trauma, Clinical Strategies and Techniques for Healing Invisible Wounds by Kenneth V. Hardy, Ph.D. Narrated by Terrence Kidd. Note to readers: this book is intended as a general information resource for professionals practicing in the field of psychotherapy and mental health. It is not a substitute for appropriate training or clinical supervision. Standards of clinical practice and protocol change over time. No technique or recommendation is guaranteed to be safe or effective in all circumstances, and neither the publisher nor the author can guarantee the complete accuracy, efficacy, or appropriateness of any particular recommendation in every respect. The names and potentially identifying characteristics of certain individuals and organizations have been changed, and some characters and organizations are composites. Also, some dialogue and scenarios have been reconstructed, and some are composites. Any URLs in this book link or refer to websites that existed as of press time. The publisher is not responsible for and should not be deemed to endorse or recommend any website, app, or other content that it did not create. The author also is not responsible for any third-party material. Author's Note: throughout this book, I will refer to the deaths of people of color, including the police-involved deaths of Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, and Walter Scott, and the killing of Trayvon Martin, as murders, although I do not intend by this the legal meaning of the term murder. None of those involved in these killings were convicted of murder. Indeed, those involved in the deaths of Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, and Eric Garner were not charged at all, and Trayvon Martin's killer was acquitted. Thus, technically and legally, a murder never occurred in these cases. However, as a black man who is haunted incessantly by these heinous acts, I walk and breathe daily feeling the weight and the deep dark despair of these untimely deaths. Living intimately with the inescapable pain and what these killings have meant and continue to mean for me and others in my community, it would feel like a whitewashed act of dishonor, disrespect, and betrayal to morally and spiritually label these acts of terror in any other way than to call them murder. Thus, my use of the term murder in this book in reference to such killings is meant to reflect my personal, moral, spiritual beliefs, and not as a legal term. Preface. In the midst of finishing this book, I inadvertently stumbled across a poem from decades ago, scribbled on yellow tablet paper, sandwiched between papers in a file comprised of letters that I have received over the years from clients, workshop attendees, and former students. While rereading it for the first time in well over a decade, I had a poignant memory of the actual moment that inspired its composition. It was a day when the pangs and pain of working in a predominantly white organization had taken its toll. An organization that, although located in a richly diverse region, could never seem to find qualified minorities to hire. The reported lack of access, and not the lack of racial sensitivity and humility that permeated most of the place, was always their justification for the dearth of people of color granted the privilege to work there. Through the commitment and dedication of a few radical white members of the leadership team, I was the first black person and, in fact, the first person of color hired there. My presence was publicly lauded as a testament to their goodness as white people, the openness and inclusiveness of the organization, as I was visible proof that they were not racist. After all, how could they be racist if they hired and welcomed me? Throughout my tenure, a lot was said, but most impactful was all that was not said, at least not verbally. No one ever called me a nigger, although the term was casually and comfortably used in a few meetings, not in reference to any people of color, but to a white team member who felt like an outsider, which made the usage acceptable, and it was treated with impunity. While often being assured that I was a valuable member of the team, I felt neither valued nor like a member. The words of embrace that were often used could not adequately conceal the tone, innuendo, coded language, and dispositions of discomfort and awkwardness they consistently and invariably conveyed. There was a powerful visceral and visible disconnect that was virtually impossible to address directly. The few attempts I made to address these issues were rarely received as an invitation for us all to engage in self-reflection and self-interrogation. Instead, the onus was placed on me to examine my proclivity to play the race card, to figure out why I and others like me were so unjustifiably angry, difficult to work with, and inherently incapable of seeing the big picture, whatever the hell that was. Sitting in countless meetings in which the lives of black and other people of color were treated as a casual game of whack-a-mole often left me enraged, but more often deeply hurt. My colleagues didn't seem to understand that their nonchalant, often dismissive and pejorative references to war-zone neighborhoods and lazy, ambitionless people who were addicted to wanting something for nothing, handout seekers, wannabe radicals, and revolutionaries, and a host of other derogatory racialized terms referred to human beings, many of whom I interacted with daily outside of work, many of whom had generously provided their backs and limited resources to help educate me and other people of color to overcome the walls of racism so we could be in such a meeting where we would be referred to in such callous and uncaring ways. Back to the poem. The inspiration for it was from an intense meeting with my immediate supervisor who sternly cautioned me about being too emotional in meetings. My tone, he admonished, was at times too impassioned, and I needed to find a way to see the big picture because everything was not always about race. I felt not only deeply misunderstood, but also incredibly invisible to him and my other white colleagues. Without any empirical and objective data or proof, which many whites often demand regarding race, I was convinced that when he looked at me, he, like so many other whites, could only see an image of who he believed me to be. I began to reflect on how we, as black people, are overly seen in some contexts and completely invisible in others. I started thinking about how I, as a black man, am often just an image of a man, and I started thinking, feeling, and scribbling. As the poem might suggest, in one sense, I have been mentally writing this book most of my life. Virtually every sentence, paragraph, and page have been carefully and internally etched in my psyche over the years. Pages have been written, rewritten, and reviewed innumerable times. Although this is my first attempt to pull it all together in one comprehensive and coherent document on paper in this format, the data have been painstakingly collected over decades. The sources have been many and varied, including conversations with great-grandparents who still wore the scars of the legacy of slavery, with parents who lived through the Jim Crow era in the past and with its painful remnants as an integral part of their contemporary lives, with clients, workshop attendees, and students, and of course, my own lived experience as a black man. Images of a man. I am a black man. I am many things, some things, and in many respects, I am considered nothing at all. I am suspect, criminal, a menace to society. I am a black man. I am many things, some things, and in many respects, I am nothing at all. I am brute, powerful, and endowed in daunting physical might. I am impulsive, primitive in my thinking, and intellectually light. I am a black man. I am an abuser of black women, and stalker of those who are white. I am the shadowy, dark, looming universal symbol of peril during both day and night. I am a black man. I am dependent on cigarettes, booze, weed, and crack cocaine. I am worthless, workless, homeless, and borderline insane. I abandon my children, am heartless, with little capacity for pain. I am the shameless, faceless, subhuman, seldom called by his name. I am a black man. I am emancipated yet forever chained to a legacy of slavery. I am told to work hard, bitter-free, because there is equal opportunity. I am a black man. I am a modern-day slave dressed in a business suit, Nautica, Fila, Polo, and Tommy Hilfiger. I am a child of affirmative action, often regarded as a new kind of nigger. I am a black man, and it doesn't seem to matter what I say, do, or who I am, or where I stand, because you seem to only be able to see the images of a man. Thinking back, thinking black. I am the firstborn son of proud parents who are natives of the Old South. I was born and raised in the northeast region of the United States, in a region of a state that was racially diverse, but also rigidly segregated by race in ways that were much more sophisticated than what my parents experienced in the South. Blacks and whites shared the same land, occupied the same city, but lived in two separate and, though it is almost too cliché to say, unequal worlds. Neighborhoods and schools alike were segregated in every sense of the word. There were some racially integrated high schools, which were the places where the worlds of white and black students converged and, often, clashed. We were foreigners to each other. Our knowledge of each other was relegated to stereotypes, innuendo, and a polite and acceptable distance. To each of us the other was an other. Interestingly, as powerful as these realities were, they were never acknowledged, never discussed. Yet the issue of race had a pervasive impact on virtually all aspects of school life. The white students, despite the fact that many of them lived less than a quarter-mile away from black neighborhoods, thought of themselves as better than the black students. Unfortunately, many of the black students, like myself, were also at some level convinced that whites were superior to us. The places that black people lived were officially called the projects. There were no whites in the projects. Conversely, the whites lived in places referred to by names such as villages, complexes, and developments. There were no blacks in places called villages. And yet, the only discernible difference between the projects and these other places of residence was the name attached to them. Through the eyes of a child, these inequities were hard to understand and even more difficult to embrace. These experiences, though never discussed or overtly acknowledged, were powerful markers of reality. They provided a rude awakening to the harshness of the world into which so many children of color are born. No matter how loving, secure, intact, or dedicated one's family is, the forces of racial oppression have a way of infiltrating the psychosocial interior of everyday family life. The forces of racial oppression erase and erode dreams, blemish innocence, and viciously assault one's sense of idealism. Yes, these are the realities of the anatomy of oppression and the concomitant invisible wounds that lacerate the heart, the soul, and the psyche. Sadly, neither their presence in the lives of those who are targeted, nor the long-term deleterious effects that they have on every fiber of human life are ever acknowledged. Thus, the invisible wounds of oppression often remain invisible to both those who suffer from them as well as those who are responsible for inflicting them. Racial oppression, regardless of the age of onset, is like an untreatable cancer. In a slow, deliberate, progressive way, it makes its mark, it takes its toll, it maims, mutilates, weakens the spirit and the body. The effects are even more poignant and especially harmful for young, poor, minority children who are often ill-prepared to understand the complexity of their social conditions. This was certainly true for me as a young boy. Throughout both my youth and my innocence, long before I finished high school or attended college, I was introduced, though I had no language for them, to the very concepts that I write about in this book. Long before I developed any conversance with the term devaluation, I knew what it meant and, more importantly, what it felt like to be degraded and disregarded. No, I didn't know the words in terms such as degradation and assault of dignity, but I knew how it felt to be thought of and referred to in racially derogatory ways and denied access to opportunities because of my race. My lack of knowledge of these grand social psychological concepts never once prevented my heart from weeping, as I watched countless numbers of white men and women, who were half my father's age, quickly reduce him to non-human status by the cold, calculated, disrespectful, and belittling ways in which they spoke to him. I knew nothing about objectification, devaluation, or degradation back in those days, only humiliation, not as a concept, just as the powerfully painful, unnameable experience it was. Finding ways to make peace with humiliation is integral to the experiences of the racially oppressed. In many ways, humiliation and devaluation are at the core of virtually all the defining experiences of people of color, the poor, and other oppressed and marginalized people. It is these core properties of the oppressed that give birth to many of the invisible wounds that will be discussed throughout this book. Growing up African American, my encounters, bouts, and hardships with humiliation and devaluation contributed heavily to this book long before I ever signed a contract. While the forces of racial oppression have been generous to me in terms of providing me with life lessons to prepare me for this project, there remain a couple of experiences that will forever be inerasable. Fragile Guys and Supermen. It was 9:35 p.m. on an otherwise quiet and uneventful fall Sunday night, but there was tension at the corner of Oak and Vine Streets, where tempers were flaring, several revolvers were drawn, and an angry crowd was growing exponentially by the minute. As several police sectioned off a corner of the street to strategically contain their captive, several additional police cars, with red flashing lights and sirens that could be heard from blocks away, arrived at the scene. I was their captive. I had been stopped by a police officer for, supposedly, failing to come to a complete stop at a stop sign and for having a passenger riding on my motorcycle without a helmet. With my heart beating fast and my body on the verge of hyperventilating, I was overcome with fear, as I am any time I am accosted by the police. My heavy breathing and the rapid palpitations of my heart had nothing to do with guilt or innocence, right or wrong, law or lawlessness. It was solely about black and white. I was hyper-aware of race at that moment, and of the strained relationship that has historically existed between the police and black men. In a fruitless attempt to counteract and disguise my fear, I immediately assumed a hyper-compliant, hyper-polite stance that I often reserved for desperate situations where I had to interact with powerful, pro-racist whites who held absolute power over me. I flawlessly implemented all the lessons that had been passed on to me and to so many other black children. All my responses to Officer Callahan, the policeman who stopped me, were of the yes sir, no sir variety. But all my efforts seemed to matter little, as Officer Callahan continued to talk and interact with me in an aggressive and belligerent manner. To make matters worse, I did not have the registration card for my motorcycle in my possession. However, the officer quickly verified via the Department of Motor Vehicles' centralized computer system that the cycle was legally registered to me. For some reason, none of this seemed to satisfy or comfort Officer Callahan. He told me that he was going to have my motorcycle towed since I didn't have proof of ownership. I stood quietly and rather stoically, as I was left with the discouraging notion that there was nothing I could do to improve this situation. Officer Callahan then began to yell at me. "Just who in hell do you think you are, boy? Where are your eyeglasses?" He was responding to a code on my driver's license that indicated that I am required to drive with corrected vision. My reply, "I am wearing contact lenses, sir." At which point, he took his heavy-duty flashlight, shining it in both of my eyes, and said, "I don't see no damn contacts. Take one out." I stood motionless, and I was confused about what to do next, so I made my first effort to reason with him. "Sir, my hands are dirty, and I really don't want to stick my dirty finger in my eye to take a lens out. I swear I have contact lenses on. Please check again." "Did you hear me, boy?" he replied. I said, "Take out the goddamn contact and take it out now." You don't fucking get to decide whether you take it out. Take the fucking contact out now. Overwhelmed with fear, anger, and a profound sense of degradation, I reluctantly removed the contact lens. But even that did not bring an end to this developing nightmare. As I was removing the lens, the truck arrived to tow my motorcycle. Officer Callahan looked at me and said, "Hook the bike up to the truck." With tears beginning to form in both eyes, I said to him, "Sir, I am not going to hook the bike to the truck. I don't think that is my role." "Did you hear me, boy? I said hook the goddamn bike up to the truck and do it now." This time I just stood quietly. He then stood toe-to-toe directly in front of me and poked me forcefully on my nose with his finger as he stated repeatedly, "Do you hear me, boy? Answer me, boy." He continued to poke me with his finger until my nose began to bleed. I was standing there in the middle of the street, with blood covering my upper lip and coldly dripping down and off my chin, surrounded by several officers, while Officer Callahan continued to jab me with his finger, calling me boy. I cannot think of another time in my entire life that I have felt so humiliated, so dehumanized and degraded. While the entire group of onlookers who had begun gathering from the beginning seemed totally sympathetic to my situation, I still felt like a cheap spectacle or some kind of caged animal in a zoo. I was seething inside. I was inundated with thoughts such as, why am I taking this shit? Could it be any worse if he kills me? Is this what I went to school all these years for? What if this erupts into a riot? My God, there are a lot of young people out here. Too many to die. I finally said in a resolute manner, "Officer, you have just written me a ticket. You know my name. I will not answer you until you address me by my name." "Who in hell do you think you are talking to, boy? Answer me," as he continued to poke me in the nose. "Answer me. Answer me. Answer me." I would not answer Officer Callahan, but I did answer an older black woman who was just a few steps away from the encounter. I now had only a pool of blood and numbness in the region of my face where my nose ought to be. I was convinced that my nose was broken, and I was furious to be so defenseless at the hands of such unbridled and unashamed hatred and humiliation. Mrs. Jackson, an African-American grandmother in her 70s, began to cry and asked rhetorically, "Why do these cops have to be so nasty to us? Lord, why do they have to be so mean and full of hatred? I just don't understand it." Her quiet, godly voice and philosophical reflection amid all the chaos and the blood was exactly what I needed. I turned to Mrs. Jackson and calmly stated, "Miss, I understand it perfectly. You see, they find these fragile guys, they give them a badge and a gun, and they become supermen overnight." As foolish as doing this was, for a split second, my sarcastic and self-destructive analysis offered me some very short-lived, momentary relief. Officer Callahan became furious. He cuffed me immediately, threw me on the hood of his police car, and began to beat me with his nightstick. "Smart-ass, you are going to jail. We will see how smart you are there." My girlfriend, who was the passenger without a helmet, attempted to retrieve my helmet from the street, only to be told to leave it alone as the officer kicked it down the street. Several bystanders were now yelling obscenities at the police and demanding that they release me. I was screaming from the blows across the back of my neck, lower back, and arm, while also begging several young African-American youth to stay cool and not get involved. I feared for their lives and mine. Officer Callahan was totally out of control and full of rage, and the crowd was becoming increasingly disruptive as they witnessed what was a familiar drama on the streets of urban black America. Another cop, another black man, and more black blood shed. I was arrested for terrorist threats toward a police officer, disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, resisting arrest, and attempting to incite a riot. Through this all, I remained in a state of shock. To this day, I recall very little of the ride to jail. What I will always remember is the process of being admitted to the holding cell, a polite name for jail. The fingerprinting process provided a powerful and painful dose of reality. So did the mugshot. It hit me harder than any of the blows previously landed by Officer Callahan earlier that night. It occurred to me that I was a criminal. I am in jail. This was an embarrassing and terrifying experience for someone who had never had any prior brushes with the law. This was my first glimpse of the inside of a jail, and it was a gruesome experience. Once the arresting officers discovered that I had a doctorate, they began to taunt me. "Oh, we got one of those smart-ass niggers here." No wonder he had so much to say, one officer stated, and I heard a group of them erupt into uncontrollable laughter. My jail time was over within 24 hours, and I was released on my own recognizance. However, the complete ordeal lasted for almost 2 years post-release. I had watched this experience take a toll on my family of origin. My parents had conflicting views about what my legal strategy should be for resolution. My father was adamant that I should plea bargain. He thought that I should accept one of the prosecutor's many offers to plead guilty to a lesser offense and get probation. He was worried that I would be convicted, not because of guilt, but because of race. Growing up in the South in the 1930s had taught him invaluable lessons about what he often referred to as the white man's laws and the white man's justice. He believed, as his life experience had often taught him, that fair trials don't exist for black people who are up against whites. He had too many memories of innocent blacks, particularly males, and many of whom were close friends of his, who had been convicted of raping white girls, when in fact their crimes were perhaps looking at one for a second too long, or simply speaking when they were expected to remain silent. On more than one occasion, my father reminded me, "Kenny, take your freedom, because they want to see black folks like you in jail. Son, don't give them the satisfaction." My mother, on the other hand, was outraged by the assault on my dignity, which she felt was a violation of the entire family. She urged me to fight this to the end, no matter what the emotional or financial costs. She repeated something to me that I had heard her grandmother, my great-grandmother, say on many occasions: "Your name is more valuable than gold. All you have is your name. When you lose your name, you lose your dignity. And what are we and who are we without dignity?" She believed that a guilty plea, no matter how insignificant the charge, was tantamount to another public beating. Despite their underlying support, I knew there was a subtle unspoken form of humiliation that plagued my parents throughout this ordeal. Although they never once uttered the words, I knew they felt powerless and defenseless as parents, but also as black people. After all, what could be more debilitating for any parent than to have to stand by helplessly and watch the flesh of your flesh be stripped of his humanity and sense of dignity, and to know that there isn't a damn thing you could do to rectify the situation? When it comes to parenting and race, this is part of what it means to be a parent of color. When it comes to being and race, this is part of what it means to be a person of color. Eventually, after a series of unsuccessful attempts by the prosecutor to convince me to plea bargain and several trial continuances, my day in court arrived. It was a very emotional time for me. It was such a relief to finally get to this point. It had been a long, tumultuous journey, fraught with unending uncertainties. The trial, for a variety of reasons, had been continued and delayed at least a half a dozen times. While I was aware there was a range of possible outcomes, it was still a tremendous relief just to get into the courtroom. At last, all the waiting, guessing, sleepless nights and nightmares would finally come to an end, hopefully. My family, along with my girlfriend and friends, showed up for the trial as they had for every scheduled court date. While I appreciated their presence, unbeknown to even them, they could offer me little reassurance because their faces spoke what they would not dare utter in words. They were petrified they harbored the same fears, worries, and anxieties that I was feeling so intensely. As I sat waiting,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?